We're going to be talking about exploring Agile. So here's kind of our outline of where we're going to go. We're going to start with kind of the problem in software development that we're looking to solve. We'll talk about the solution. Then we're going to come and talk about how Agile values help us achieve those solutions, and then also about the principles that will, the Agile principles. And then we're going to talk a little bit about frictions. So kind of a piece that often gets left out that really is what makes this work. Okay, so starting with the problem. So if we think of waterfall style development, one of the problems we run into it, so let's talk about the problem that we're trying to solve in software development. So in software development, it's a very important thing. It's a very difficult thing to do. One of the old ways of doing software development was to focus on waterfall. And waterfall really takes the approach that existed in the way that we build buildings. So waterfall development, you spend a long time waiting for value. So if you think about how we approach a construction project, you usually wait till the building's done before you can move in, or at least a large portion of it's done. So you're waiting to get that value toward the end of the project before you can start to use it. Now, maybe you can get a house, you could build a house and not finish the basement and maybe start getting value out of it soon. But for the most part, waterfall is an approach that lets us plan everything out, we execute the plan, and then value is delivered. Whoops, let me go there. It also means, the problem with that is it means that you're also delaying your evidence. So you're waiting, spending more time waiting to get to the point that you actually have evidence that what you're doing is going to work. Now, with software or with construction projects, that may be okay. Our construction projects are often very, very well defined, and we're doing the same thing we've always done over and over again. Software oftentimes has a lot more unknowns in it, and if you try to plan out so much that you no longer have any unknowns, you have to basically do all the work of solving of creating the software, just by the nature of how software works. Another problem with waterfall that you run into is there's a lack of flexibility. Usually, if you're creating a skyscraper, you probably aren't going to get halfway through it and then decide, you know what, we want to add another 50 stories on top, which means we need to change the foundation and go down another 100 feet. You don't have that type of flexibility with buildings. And what happened is when we started using that approach to of creating buildings and those type of projects and brought it to software, we've lost some of the inherent flexibility that we have in software projects if we're still trying to follow that same project management model. And that doesn't mean that waterfall is bad. It's just good at things that may not necessarily take advantage of some of the differences between doing stuff in code and doing stuff in concrete. Okay, so another piece of the problem, trust. There's been some studies done on trust, and when you're trying to build trust, so I think between a software team and the business that you're building stuff for, or you could think in terms of your the people that are going to use the building and the people that are building the building. Trust is based on more on the frequency of doing trustworthy things than it is on the magnitude. So if you think about it this way, if somebody saves your life one time 10 years ago, you start to drown and they pull you out. 10 years ago, they saved your life. That's a pretty good thing, right? They saved your life. Wonderful. You may have some trust for them based on the fact they saved your life. However, the person that shows up every day and brings you coffee, just because they like you and just to tell you that you're doing a good job or something like that, and does that every day for 5-10 years, is probably going to have more trust in your mind just because of the frequency that they're doing very small things for you or doing something trustworthy for you. You can know you can count on them because they've done something small very, very frequently. So with software, this is something that waterfall kind of pushes to the end. You don't actually start getting experience with what you're given until the end of it. So that tends to lower trust and also makes it harder to adjust as you go. Having evidence of success, showing that something is actually going to work, showing we've created this software and it does what we expected it to do. Now, this is aside from the return on investment implications of it. But when you're creating software, it's really good to start thinking about what am I doing to prove that I'm actually trustworthy in creating the software? What type of evidence am I offering the people that are paying for it that this is going to do what they want? And not just on the side of evidence of success, but evidence of handling small failures. If you're working with a team and they're working on software and something doesn't go right, building the trust around understanding that they know how to handle that and that they're going to bring it to you and you're going to work together, that's a huge deal in building the trust around the software project. So we're trying to build trust not only by showing success, but showing how we take small failures and turn them into something successful. And this often gets left out when we're thinking about developing software, that sometimes things are going to go wrong. And if we can take an approach that lets us do those on a small scale so we can build trust and build experience around them, we're going to be much better off than if we're in a situation where we're deferring that until the very, very end and then discover, oh, you know what? We don't know how to handle large failures because we never learned how to handle small failures. Or we don't know how to handle any failure because we haven't actually gone through that process of dealing with something when it's small enough that we can actually fix it. So let's talk about an example. There was a treasury system that that was being rewritten, and I wasn't directly involved in any of it. They had brought me in to give them some ideas for things, and so I made some suggestions, but just on a very short time frame. And it went on for a long, long period of time, but they were deferring their evidence of delivering working code. The way their process was working, they were getting things through, counting stories as being complete, even if it created a bunch of bugs, and those went on the backlog. So they were actually creating bugs on the backlog faster than they were delivering code. So they didn't have any evidence of delivering complete working code for the user, for the treasury. There was also no evidence of quality, which now this led to obviously a very adversarial relationship. I heard somebody say that they were now entering the litigation phase of software development. The project eventually got canceled. And this was a tragedy, but part of what made it go wrong, there are a lot of issues here, but one of the big parts is they were deferring that evidence of delivering working code, and they were deferring the evidence of quality. And that's type of approach is what's very easy to have happen in waterfall, and Agile values and Agile principles try to steer away from these types of failures. Even if the project were to be canceled, it would be better to be canceled in like 6 months and discovering, hey, this just isn't going to work, or we don't understand the problem space, or we just can't work together, and have that feedback early on instead of being way into the project before you discover that something went wrong. Okay, so there's the problem. So let's zoom back out. The problem with software development that is just kind of inherent in software development. So let's talk about a solution. So kind of from where we are today, or how things can be if we're applying project management principles that come from waterfall and construction, to where we could be tomorrow. So we'll start here with trust. So how can we create trust early on? Well, do trustworthy things. But remember that thing about the frequency versus magnitude. We want to do trustworthy things very, very often. And one of the biggest things we can do that's trustworthy is deliver working code. Get code out to where the user can actually use it. Now, if we're trying to follow this, it might really change how we're delivering software. Instead of trying to deliver a big piece of something that does everything the customer asks for, we might try to carve off just a small piece that we can get into production that will start making their lives better, even if it's just a fraction of what they're asking for. And this can be really, really hard to do, but it's very, very valuable. And it's really easy to look at this and say, oh, well, if I took more of a waterfall approach of delivering all these things together, it would be more efficient, because if I deliver piece by piece, I'll have to rewrite it. And it might be more efficient in terms of lines of code that end up in the final process, but it's rarely more efficient in terms of actually delivering things, building trust, and making the project successful. Okay, evidence. So iterative delivery. This is where iterative delivery, the idea of delivering a piece of thing and then another piece of things, builds the evidence that you can actually make a project successful. It also helps you build the evidence, like I said, of how you're going to handle things when they fail. When you deliver something to a customer and it turns out it's not what they want, the evidence of how that's handled, how it's reworked, how you go ahead and keep quality in it, even if there's a miscommunication, how you improve your processes through that is a huge, huge deal. So show me, don't tell me. If you have a team that's delivering software and they spend all their time telling you what the software is supposed to do and telling you how they're going to give you great software, it's better off to just actually show you the software. I've found that on some of the projects my company works on, we'll go through and kind of talk to the user about what they want, but we try to be very, very willing to give them something to look at sooner rather than later. So if we could talk for another 3, 4, 5 hours about what they want to make sure we get it completely right, we're better off, oftentimes, to go ahead and deliver what they ask for, particularly if it's something we can turn around in about 8 hours and get feedback from them. of actually showing them, here's what we understood what you wanted. Do you need any of this changed in any way? And if our processes are built with the idea that we're going to make changes to this to iterate and grow it, and we've invested heavily in tests, the showing me and letting them actually use it is much more valuable than just talking about it. Now, obviously, you have to talk about what the software needs to do, but you get a lot more value out of getting real code into the user's hand. Deliver something before you deliver everything. Like I said, this can be very, very hard to do, but it's extremely powerful. If you feel you have to wait until you have the entire project done before the user can do anything, that's often a very, very big red flag. That if anything possibly goes wrong, if there's any slight misunderstanding of what's being asked for, you won't actually be able to give them something that gives them a return on investment. However, if you're able to deliver them something they can start using early on, that makes a huge difference in their ability to, in your feedback loop, and dramatically increases your chances of success. I've mentioned the story of a project I worked on that needed to be multilingual. But when we actually talked to them about what they could use right away, they said, well, our first client is in English. If we could get this in English and get it working, we really want the multilingual, but we could actually sell this to the client, sell this process to the client right now. So we delivered it in English first, and I think 2 or 3 weeks later went through and rewrote it so it was multilingual and could handle any language they wanted, and they could go in and add those languages to all the strings that appeared in the software. That was very, very valuable to them, but if we had have waited to give them everything they wanted, they wouldn't have got the same return on investment, and they wouldn't have been able to capture that first client that was based on having it right away. Okay, so here's another example. So this was another treasury system that took a very, very different approach. In this system, they had, so look at here over on this side, right? 10 developers, took 4 years to go live, cost about $15 million, and they were at the point that they could deploy every 7 days all the way through to production. And I think they've been doing that for the past 6 years, 7 days all the way through to production. This project was originally quoted as needing 50 developers, taking 5 years to go live, costing $50 million, and was in a position where it was taking 6 months deployment to get to production. This was the difference over here of trying to acquire evidence early on and do iterative delivery versus over here, which was taking more of a waterfall approach, or what the plan was to take more of a waterfall approach. Now, they were couching it as Agile, but based on the other projects that they were doing with this type of process, it was still very much kind of in the waterfall camp. So anything we can do to get our projects over here, like this, is going to be very, very beneficial to your organization or to you as a taxpayer. Okay, so that was kind of the solution of talking through things we can do to solve the problem we talked about earlier of some of the risks we run into with when we're dealing with waterfall development. And keep in mind, the waterfall development is not that waterfall is not a good way to plan any types of projects. It's just that it doesn't inherently have it doesn't inherently take advantage of things you can do in code that you can't do in concrete. So waterfall is very much set up for delivering things that are more like concrete, less so for delivering software. And an example of that, if you think of sending a Mars rover to Mars, that's something that you kind of, in the past, when you had to have all the code ready and you shipped it to Mars and you had to run it, you had to have that all worked out ahead of time. You couldn't iterate on it. It had to be all ready to go and then ships to Mars. Now they can actually update the landers as they're being sent to Mars. So they have to get to a certain level with it, and then they send it to Mars and start updating it, even while it's flying there or after it's on the Mars surface. That's a different in technology, and as our technology capabilities have changed, we're able to do things in a more iterative way than we could be before. Just like as we move from dealing with concrete to dealing with code, we're able to do different things, and we need to make sure our project management keeps up with those new capabilities. Okay, so let's look at the Agile values. So here are the 4 Agile values, and we're going to dig into each of these. So individuals and interactions. Agile says that we value individual and interactions over processes and tools. This doesn't mean that we're not going to have any processes. It doesn't mean we're not going to use awesome tools, but it means that if we had to choose between these two things, we're going to place more value on having these individuals and interactions than we are on having processes and, really, really good processes and tools. So that's what we want to, that's what Agile said. We value this over this. Doesn't mean we won't have this, just that this takes priority for us. Agile says, when it comes to working software, Agile says we value working software over comprehensive documentation. Doesn't mean we're not going to have any type of documentation, but if we are delivering massive amounts of documentation and never getting around to delivering working software, we're not actually following Agile. We want to make sure that we're prioritizing the working software, as that's more important to us. It's got more value to us than comprehensive documentation. I was giving a talk similar to this at a large bank, for a small group at a large bank. And when I got to this part, somebody said, "Oh, I completely disagree with that. That's wrong. That doesn't work here." I was like, "What?" He said, "No, that doesn't work." And I said, "It doesn't mean that we're not going to have any documentation. It just means that, obviously delivering working software is more important than comprehensive documentation, because no matter how much documentation we deliver, if the software doesn't work, no one can use it." And he still strongly disagreed with me, and it really threw me off my script. So I finally said, "Okay, well, why do you think that?" And he said, "No, comprehensive documentation is more important than working software, because we have to know who to blame when something goes wrong." And it was kind of a sad moment, because he was speaking very candidly and very correctly about the environment he was working in his environment, from not only his point of view, but how he was being treated within that environment. Working software was not the highest priority because he could get in more trouble for not having documenting who to blame when something went wrong than delivering working software and continuing to iterate to make it better. Those aren't great environments to work in, but he was accurately expressing the environment, the department he was actually working with there. Customer collaboration. So Agile says that we value customer interaction over contract negotiation. Doesn't mean we won't have contracts, but we want to make sure that we're interacting with the customer. If you've ever been in a situation where it's like, "Oh, we want to talk to the customer and the customer and the developers need to talk. Well, we need to change our contract for them to be able to talk." That probably means your contract is not set up very, very well. We want to value the actual interacting with customers, which means we need to form our contracts, if we do have contracts that are driving things, form them in a way that keep us from getting in a situation where we have to rework the contract in order to get customer interaction. Let me go mute everybody here just a second. There we go. Okay. Next, responding to change. Agile values say that we value responding to change over following a plan. I think it's Eisenhower that said, "Planning is essential, but plans are useless." This doesn't mean we don't have any type of plan. But if we have a plan and we know it's not going to work because something has changed, we don't keep following the plan, right? We respond to change. And having this mindset of that being our value, that we're going to try to deliver software in response to a changing environment, is one of the things that makes Agile very, very, very powerful. And this is different than buildings, right? If you're trying to build a building and lay your foundation for a building, and you're trying to do it on something that's moving like the ocean and is continually changing, that's not a very good environment to build that building. Software, on the other hand, is a little bit different. You may be deploying into an environment where the market is constantly changing, and what you set out in your plan you were going to do may be irrelevant. Maybe you start going into a market with something, and then Google enters that space and provides what you were going to charge people for free. Well, you could keep on following your plan, but you may need to respond to change and say, "Okay, we at least need to differentiate ourselves, if not pivot to either a different segment or a different product in order to respond to the change that the environment has." Here's an example of someone not responding to change. Their plan was to put the roof in, right? Or their plan was to first build the boards, and they got there and somebody had a ladder there. Well, they weren't going to respond to the change and move the ladder. They were going to go ahead and just put the boards where it said to put the boards. And then they put their roof on, and there was a ladder sticking up through it. Well, no one wanted to go ahead and change anything, so they just went ahead and followed their plan, which was to roof it, and just kind of broke it around that. So this is, for me, a very good visual image of, am I doing this with software? Am I following this plan, which was to roof the building like this, without actually thinking about the fact that something has changed? I'm in a different environment than I was expecting to be in, and I need to behave accordingly. I need to do something differently. Let's see here. Yeah, I like the thing. Most cybersecurity organizations are exactly like that, comprehensive documentation with names to know who to blame. And I think that's where you kind of come the difference between cybersecurity that's being done in order to actually lower your risk and cybersecurity that's being done to know who to blame when something goes wrong. Um, Actually lowering risk oftentimes looks very, very different. Okay, so there we started with problem, talking about waterfall development. We looked at a solution, talking about iterative development. We looked at the agile values right there. Got to get the ball in my hand. There we go. And now we're going to talk about the principles. This is really where I see the meat of agile comes into play, is the principles. Oh, actually, I forgot one thing before we dig into these. Okay, so I'd like to see you rank these in terms of how important they are for creating successful software. Now, it's not, in reality, none of these are necessarily maybe more important than others, but just in your experience, what have you seen as being the most important for creating successful software? I'll paste the link here one more time. And there's no right or wrong answer here. This is just what you've tended to see. We've got working software in the top space, followed by customer collaboration. We've got Ty. Oh, we're moving around. And like I said, these all interact, right? It's going to be very hard to produce working software that the customer can actually use if we don't collaborate with the customer. It's going to be hard to produce working software that the customer can actually use if we're ignoring responding to change and just delivering what we originally planned. We might deliver software that works for an environment that no longer exists. And I'd encourage everybody to go ahead and click on that link in the chat, or go to minty.com and do that. And just leave it up as we go. We've got a few other things we're going to do. And the goal of it, kind of going through this, isn't because there's a right or wrong answer. It's not, but this is a very helpful way for us to interact with the principles and the values. So I encourage you to take advantage of that as we do. It'll help make it easier to remember things. Okay, Bob says, sometimes the processes just can't keep pace and cause friction. Change development tools to produce the documentation, and then customer to use my database, not wait for its output. So that's pretty cool. That is one thing that what Bob mentioned sounds a little bit like what some teams have gotten a lot of value from behavior-driven development, where you start saying, okay, we need to actually say what this software does. If we can make that the requirements and the tests make our requirements so they execute against it, we shorten our cycle time and build the artifacts we need in a way that actually helps us to continue to do the development, not something that just becomes static and eventually no one looks at because they know it's out of date. Okay, moving on. Okay, other slides. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through these principles and then kind of rate how easy they are to follow and how important we feel they are to our success. So I'll leave that other thing up there if you want to do that as we go. But let's start with the principle about satisfying the customer. Agile says that our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. It's amazing how often teams aren't actually using this as their highest priority. But this is what Agile is saying. Highest priority is to satisfy the customer. We can do all kinds of work that doesn't actually satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. But if that isn't your highest priority, it probably means you're not following Agile, or at least as full as you could be. And you may be able to do a lot more as a team if you do try to follow this. Changing requirements. Agile says that we should welcome changing requirements, even late in development. Agile processes harness change for the customer's competitive advantage. If you want to be able to welcome changing requirements, that implies you can actually change your software without it falling apart. The development work you will do to be able to welcome changing requirements looks significantly different than development work you would do if you're not worried about anything ever changing. If you want to welcome changing requirements, you're going to have to invest in quality in ways that you won't have to invest in it or might choose not to invest in it if you're not as worried about quality. For example, if you want to be able to change things quickly in your application, even late in development process, you're going to have tests that let you actually prove it works the way that you expect it to work. That's one of the big things I've seen in people that are investing in test is that they're usually trying to follow this of saying, we'll give you something to look at and use, give us any feedback, and we'll rework your requirements if once you've seen what you asked for, it doesn't do what you expect it to do. We're going to welcome that and build that type of thing into our process to take advantage of it rather than trying to fight with it. Shorter time scale. Agile says that we want to deliver working software frequently from a couple of weeks to a couple of months with a preference to the shorter time scale. I mentioned a few times there's a organization I was working with here in town, a company I was working with in town, and we were getting the first thing we delivered for them, I think took 60 days, and we got it down to 30 days and 15 days. Finally, most of the stuff they were asking for, we were delivering overnight. So they would ask for something one day and we'd have it for them the next morning to try. A very small sliver, but we were delivering working software and trying to take that all the way through to production for them. Their parent organization was very interested in this because they had been working on some software for 5 years that still wasn't delivered or doing anything. They kept on working on trying to make it better, and since then they've actually got it into production now. But they weren't delivering working software frequently. And if we think of working software, we don't think of it like this often, but software rots, right? If you're not using your software for something, it will rot. Think of it, a house, an abandoned house will fall apart very quickly if there's not someone actually there using it. Just being in a house and using it prevents all kinds of little things from just falling apart because you fix it. You remember to close the door. If a window gets broken, you fix the window. But if somebody's not there, it just can fall apart very, very quickly. Software does that too. If you deliver software that works, but it's not actually in production and it just sits there for years, you don't come back to that a year later and expect that just everything's going to work, because there's so many things that can change. You know, the things you interface with. Maybe the operating system gets upgraded and you use some feature that's not in the new version of the operating system. But delivering working software frequently means your software is actually doing something, actually doing some type of work. Working together. Business people and developers must work together daily throughout the project. While this makes sense, and most people would assume this is how software development projects work, there's a lot of places that actually kind of resist this because we don't want the developers to be interrupted by the business people. And there is a certain amount of truth in that. If you're not letting developers do development work, it's going to be hard for them to deliver something. But at the same time, if the business people know what the software needs to do and the developers are trying to do it, if you build a wall between these two groups, you're in for a lot of hurt because your developers may be able to work faster at delivering something that the business people don't want because there's not the communication happening. Okay, so with that, so we went through those 4. So let's take a look over here. And I'd encourage you to go ahead and rank these in terms of how important they are. I think we've got, how important they are to your success of your team and how difficult they are to follow. So it looks like we're kind of clustering up here. We'll get some more results in here. So like number 1, our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. People are saying that's very, very important and it's not too difficult to follow. And we're all kind of clustered here for these, which doesn't, seems about right. The mouse over this, I think this will show me. Yeah, there. So number 1, we've kind of got a spread here of some different things. 2, we've kind of got spread, and this is interesting. We've got welcome changing requirements, even late in development, agile process harness change. We've got a few people down here that says this is not important to our success and it's not difficult to follow at all. Maybe because we're saying we don't need it. And maybe there are some environments that are like that. We've got a pretty wide scatter here on things. That's kind of interesting. Number 3, which is deliver working software frequently from a couple of weeks to a couple of months. Looks like the spread on that one. Well, that's interesting. We're a little bit more to the left there. But yeah, it looks like most people are above the line in saying that it's important to their success. And it looks like most people find this not particularly difficult to follow, which is great because 10 years ago, that probably would have been really, really difficult to follow for a lot of teams. So it's kind of cool to see that shift happening. And also, I like that we're seeing so many people saying this is important. And if you're down here and saying it's not important to you, I would encourage you to think, what would your software process look like if you did prioritize it? But that might mean that you're in, for some reason, what you're doing, it's not as important. for the work that you're doing. And that's okay if it's actually not important. What you don't want to do is assume that it can't be done and then assume it's not important because you don't think it can be done when really maybe there are steps you can make toward it. So if you're deploying once a year, what would the value be of deploying every 9 months? Are there any small steps you can make to make it easier to deploy every 9 months, or 6 months, or 3 months, or 2 months, or 3 weeks, or whatever that is? Those will require investments, but Agile says those are investments that are often give you a return on investment. And last one here. Business people and developers must work together daily throughout the project. So we got lots of people saying it's important, a couple people down here saying not at all, and then a wide spread of how difficult it is to follow, which different organizations are different. What I find is at a minimum, getting it to where your daily stand-up has business people and developers actually talking through so there's clear communication. That might not be a whole bunch of working together, but it's at least a step. At least you're actually having conversations between the groups. Okay, so that moves on to the next one. I will leave that up and we'll go through the rest of these. Okay, so that was the first, the first 4. Let's go to the next one here. Build projects around motivated individuals. Give them the environment and support they need and trust them to get the job done. I like I should put the picture in here. I like using the example of, I tasked my kids with digging a hole. We were going to do a pit roast a pig. So they got out there and started digging. It didn't take long before I asked them, and they were very motivated. They're going to dig a hole in our yard. It didn't take too long, though, for me to ask them what they needed to make this work. And they're like, really, Dad, we needed an excavator. So we went and rented an excavator. And I'm glad we did, because I'm not sure we could have dug that size of hole through that much rock with them just doing it by their hands, despite their motivation and how hard they were working at it. The most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within a development team is face-to-face conversation. If you're in a situation where you hear somebody say, hey, we can just replace this or we're doing our daily stand-up, but instead of talking to each other, we're going to just email out our statuses. Well, you're missing this particular principle if your environment and culture kind of pushes you toward doing that. Now, notice it doesn't say that this is the only way to communicate, right? There's some forms of communication that being efficient and effective doesn't really buy you anything. Reminding everyone that there's a holiday coming up and they don't need to come to work on July 4th. Does that need to be face-to-face? Probably not. Maybe it would be more efficient and effective, but does that really buy you anything? Probably not. When somebody's hollering out your order, think of McDonald's, right? It shows you your order number and stuff like that. Is somebody going and looking you in the face, every person in the restaurant saying, order 95 is up. Order 95 is up. Okay, face-to-face, more efficient and effective, right? Maybe, but there's no return on investment from that. But when it comes to actually doing software development work, face-to-face conversation is the most efficient and effective, and you're probably working on things where that really, really matters. If I miss finding out that my order's up at McDonald's because it's up on screen, it takes me 30 seconds before I look again, there's nothing significantly bad that will happen with that. If I create a bunch of software because I didn't actually have a back and forth conversation about what the customer actually wanted, that may be a lot more expensive for me. Working software is the primary measure of progress. This is interesting because it's very easy to try to measure other things in terms of progress. And I know it's easy for me on software projects I work on. Like, I've done this much of coming up with what I want it to do, so I'm this far through. But if we measure in terms of working software, it helps make sure that we have as little or no hidden work possible. That's going to be a whole talk on its own there. Agile processes promote sustainable development. The sponsors, developers, and users should be able to maintain a constant pace indefinitely. So this is easy to say, but I was one of my early Agile coaching projects. I was brought in as a consultant to working with a consulting company that was providing some services for the US government. And this consulting company that sold themselves on their expertise in Agile was trying to tell the government agency, well, maybe we can just get people to work more if we give them bonuses. Is there anything we can do to get them to work longer hours? And while their intention was good, they were completely trying to work around this principle. This team was working very well. They were on a good pace, and they were working very, very hard. But trying to say we're just going to try to move them to a more breakneck pace for long periods of time violates this principle. So let's go over here and let's see. How would you rate these principles? So I think it's area 2, the most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within a development team right now, at least, is kind of lower on both axes than some of the others. So we're saying people are saying it's not very difficult, but then we've got some people saying that for them they feel it's not very, very important. And like I said, keep in mind, this doesn't mean this is the only way to convey information, but if you've got stuff that's really important to get right, you'll get more efficiency and more effectiveness out of conveying that information face to face. Post this in here just in case we had anybody join at the half-hour mark. Number 1, there's a spread there, or well, it went to 3. Working software is the primary measure of progress. Looks like most of us seeing that being important to our success, but there's a wide range of how difficult that is, and that makes sense. Some things are a lot harder to actually get working software out into production, which isn't a bad thing. It's just the reality, right? Number 1, build projects around motivated individuals, give them the environment and support they need to get the job done. And we've got most of these, it looks like most everybody's above the halfway point on how important that is to success. Different levels of difficulty, which completely makes sense because it may depend on your organization and also what type of support people actually need. Let's see, did I cover those? I don't think I got this one. Agile processes promote sustainable development. Kind of got wide scattering here, but kind of up toward the upper right-hand quadrant of how people see this is important and how difficult it is to follow. So let me go to the next one for here. Okay. Moving on. Technical excellence. Continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. This is really important because a lot of times when we start talking about delivering small and delivering frequently, it's easy to say, oh, well, then everything's just going to be really, really bad quality. Agile says that needs to be part of what you're delivering, is you still need technical excellence, even if you're delivering a very small piece of something, a very small part of functionality. I'm reading a book called The Philosophy of Software Design. He makes the case that probably 10 to 20% of your effort on any story you're working on should be toward continuous attention to technical excellence. I'm finding some way to improve the overall structure of your program based on things that you've discovered. Let's see, simplicity. Simplicity, the art of maximizing the amount of work not done, is essential. So this would probably mean for most projects, if what you're asked for that does 100% of what they want for a particular story, if there's 10% of that really could be optional, you deliver the 90% first, at least, and then maybe let the other 10% be prioritized against everything else. But the art of maximizing the amount of work not done is essential. And this can be a whole talk in and of itself, but this is very, very, very hard to do. Extremely, extremely valuable, because let's say every 5 stories you do, there's a way to actually cut the scope in half. Your chances of delivering and getting into production on time are much, much greater if you're doing that than if you're not. But you can only do it if you're actually looking for it. Self-organizing teams. The best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. There are often organizational structures that make this very, very hard to do. But don't forget that Agile, at least the way it was originally envisioned, very much works from a standpoint of being from the ground up, from the team up. So even if your organization requires some things from the top down, you can still follow a lot of this just within your team in the way that you're approaching problems. And don't overlook what you can do at your team level just because some things are harder to do on an organizational level. At regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective and then tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly. Does this sound like anything that people do on a regular basis? Bob's pointing out his deliverable being in defense industry, so it's difficult to do a final deploy. And that's a very, very good point, right? If you're building something that has to be launched into space, you may not be able to get a final deploy until you launch into space or whatever it is that you're working on. But I think still what we need to do is try to get our things all to count our progress as far to the right as possible. If we've got a dev environment and a QA environment and a staging environment and then prod, if we're just going to dev and counting that as progress, maybe we should try to make it to where we're actually going to QA or actually going to staging or whatever gets us all the way up as far as we can to actually show that there's as little hidden work as possible. But yes, that's absolutely right, Bob, that some of those things are very difficult to do in different areas. And the goal of Agile isn't to say this has to work for every single different type of software projects. The idea is that these are things we're going to value and principles we're going to try to follow as they apply within our particular organization and our particular problems. Let's see. Yes, Carol, retrospectives, right? At regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective and tunes in just behavior accordingly. This is where we get retrospectives from. Okay, so let's jump back over. I'm going to spend a little bit less time on these to kind of keep us moving. So these principles, looks like we're still kind of scattered up here at the top. Let's see. Doing retrospectives. It's interesting. Somebody's saying they don't feel this is very important to success. Retrospectives are something that can be difficult to get right. When you've worked on teams that are really getting a lot of value out of them, they can be amazing. I've also been on teams where the main thing they're used for is to complain about things that they can't change. That's been less useful in my opinion. And it can be difficult to kind of turn the ship and get to the point that people are actually doing things that get value out of them. Let's see, continuous attention to technical excellence. Looks like everybody sees this as being fairly important. Depending on your environment, it can be harder or easier. A lot of things with technical excellence are very difficult to build in after the fact. They kind of have to be built as you're doing it. So if you see yourself doing things like hardening sprints and things like that, that could be an indication that you need to push more of that technical excellence down to the individual stories as you work on them. I'm not trying to say it's easy, but that's something you should try to strive through, is get that technical excellence as part of the mindset of creating each story rather than just something that happens at the end. Simplicity. Okay, so we've got kind of a wide range here. So that's kind of interesting. Let's see. And I think the last one here, the best architectures, everything emerges from self-organizing teams. Like I said, it can vary from organization to organization, but Agile is saying that you'll get the best results from people and the best decisions made if you've actually got a self-organizing team. And this can be interesting because I don't think this necessarily means that just every single thing goes for a vote. I remember seeing an example from, was it Sparta, I think, that used to vote on everything. And there were big advantages to that, but there were also some disadvantages when they went to war, and before they could take almost any action, they had to have a big vote on it. So self-organizing teams can look different than just we're going to vote on everything, but the idea that the team's supporting itself and organizing around the best way to deliver things is a very, very powerful concept, to the extent that you can do it in your organization, in your team. But usually there's a lot more room to do that than what oftentimes gets followed. Okay, so we'll do a competitive thing just in a second here, so you can sign up for that. Okay, so we talked about the problem, solutions, values, principles. Let's talk about friction. Let me grab one of these. Type in the chat if you know what this thing is. Curious if anyone's ever seen one of these before. Yes, Bill, it's a radiometer. So this is a radiometer. I first encountered these as probably a 4 or 5 year old out in way out in western Kansas on my great grandpa's farm. He had one of these in his windows. He was a farmer, but from all the stuff I saw or heard about him later, he really wanted to be a scientist. He liked technology and stuff. He was the person responsible for wiring up a lot of the farms with electricity in his area. A fascinating individual. I wish our generations had overlapped more than the short years that they did. Anyway, he had one of these in his window, and I remember asking, how does this thing work? And I was told, oh, well, you suck all the air out of this. You put this in the sunlight. I've got LED lights, so you can't really see it here. You put it in the sunlight, and this thing spins. They used to have them at Home Depot to show how much radiation came off incandescent bulbs, so showing how much the energy was being converted to radiation instead of just light. And then LED lights, they don't spin very much. But I was told if you suck all the air out of it, you remove all the friction, then when the photons hit these things, it spins. So as an adult, I went, after he died and his son died, people were asking if there was any family heirlooms they wanted. I said, hey, if the radiometer is still there, I'd be very interested in that. But it had been lost somewhere in the move from Kansas to Missouri, which isn't a surprise. But I thought, I'm now an adult with disposable income. I will buy myself one of these. So I went and looked them up and bought one and was playing around with it and showing it to my kids. And then I thought, I had to look up how these things work. And I discovered that what I had been told was thought to be the case at the time. But the state of physics since then had actually done some more experiments and discovered that that actually wasn't the case. It turns out if you actually do remove all the air from this, it no longer works. It no longer turns in the light beams. So there's something about the way that the air inside of here interacts with light hitting these vanes that make it spin. And when I read that, I was like, this is very interesting because this really describes what we're trying to do with Agile. Yes, air produces friction. We're not trying to remove all the friction from all of our processes in delivering software. We're trying to remove enough friction that what remains can be leveraged in order to actually be able to get work done. So I keep this on my desk, and when I'm dealing with situation, working with teams and stuff, and like we're kind of hitting friction, I have to stop and ask myself, have we removed the bad friction? And is what we're hitting actually part of what actually makes Agile work? Because if we are, then we get the beauty of this thing spinning around, and Agile works well for us. If we were to try to remove all of it, we just destroy the mechanism, and it doesn't work at all. Okay, so I think that brings us to, okay, so that takes us through the talk on exploring Agile.